Hey, I'm Johnny. I'm one of the pastors in Circle of Hope. In Circle of Hope, we say we must be doers of the word. We love the Bible. We think it takes a lifetime of study, and it's a group project to apply it. We think doing the Bible really counts, not just studying it and not just knowing it. I like reading the Bible as a story told by God's children. And in the story that they're telling, they often address a specific audience with a version of the memory that they recall. And sometimes that leads to apparent contradictions. So we see this in the early history of Israel between Deuteronomy and Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We see it as the Bible writers are telling us about Jesus' life in the Gospels. And we also notably see it in two sections of the Bible. One is a history of Israel that's called the Deuteronomistic history. It's Joshua to Kings in the first section of the Old Testament, which is the first part of the Bible. And then we have someone that we sometimes call the Chronicler, who wrote what we have as 1st and 2nd Chronicles as a different telling of the story. Now, these are both the same stories being told, but sometimes we see different themes and different messages in them. So in 1st and 2nd Samuel, for example, we see themes of retribution. We see a story of the King David, particularly, that's told fit with all of his sins, all of his problems, and how his life kind of fell apart by the end of it. And then we have the Chronicler that tells us the same story, but this time David is cast in a better light. Why does the Chronicler do that? And why does the writer of Samuel do it in a different way? Because they're meeting the needs of the people that they're talking to. To get a little bit technical, the writer of Samuel is writing to people that are in Babylonian captivity. Jewish people in the southern kingdom are in Babylonian captivity in the punished position, and they're trying to figure out how they got where they are and what God is going to do. They might be recipients of punishment for rebelling against God, and they're hoping that God punishes the Babylonians for holding them captive. But by the time the Chronicler is writing, he's writing to a resettled Jerusalem under Persian occupation, where the Jewish people can freely practice their faith. Here, the writer is telling us a different story about David because he's casting, or she's casting, a new vision for how David might have been, or how a new David might be. As Christians, we might say they're foreshadowing this new David called Jesus. Now, the point of what I want to say here is that they're telling two different stories and addressing two different groups of people. The Bible writers are very comfortable with the apparent contradictions that they see. The writer of Chronicles probably had Samuel in his or her hand as they were penning Chronicles. And so they knew the different stories, and certainly the recipients of Chronicles knew that there was a different way to tell the story, and that didn't bother them like it might bother us. So if you're reading the Bible and you see these contradictions, but you see it as God's children telling the story to a specific audience for a specific reason, that might give you some comfort as you work out how you're doing the Bible together in community. But for our purposes, for Circle of Hope's purposes, this interaction and this dialogue between these two groups of people, and even more in the Bible, and how they're uniquely able to tell their story to their time and place really matters. They're creating a narrative that tells God's story. And so these days we fight over who has the right story, and we argue with each other about what the right story is. But I encourage you to listen to one another and hear how people are telling different stories and what that means to who they are and how they're experiencing the world and in their context. I want to specialize, and Circle of Hope wants to specialize in telling God's story today to the people in our region. Right in the Philadelphia metro in 2019, we're wondering, how do we tell God's story to the people that are around us? How do we tell the story to the people even watching this video, for example? So the basic question for us is, what do we need to hear about God's story? How can we share it? And the best part and the advantage that we have is that we're not really creating an us versus them. We're telling our story to one another to encourage each other, to hold each other in faith, and to grow each other. And so we like to say we're bringing the gospel to the present with great flexibility. How do we tell the story of God to ourselves and to one another? How do we want to hear it? That's what we're working with. We're interested in making a very practical, tangible expression of the gospel possible now, just like the writers of Samuel and of Chronicles did to their time, addressing their own people. We're asking God to reveal that today in us. What story does our metro need to hear? You're a part of telling that story. You're a part of receiving that story. So let's tell it together.